The courtroom buzzed with tension, a palpable electricity that seemed to hum through the polished wooden benches and echo off the high ceilings. It was a high-profile case, the kind that drew reporters, curious onlookers, and whispered gossip in the hallways. At the center of it all was a millionaire businessman, Richard Langley, whose tailored suit and confident demeanor couldn't mask the storm brewing around him. His wife, Emily, sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, her pregnancy evident in the gentle curve of her belly, her face pale but composed. Across the room, his mistress, Vanessa, radiated defiance, her sharp eyes darting between Emily and the judge's bench. The case was a messy divorce, tangled with accusations of infidelity, betrayal, and financial misconduct. But no one in the room, not the lawyers, not the reporters, not even Richard himself, could have anticipated the bombshell about to drop. The morning had started like any other high-stakes legal proceeding. Richard's legal team, a group of slick attorneys with reputations for winning unwinnable cases, had been prepped for weeks. They'd painted Emily as unstable, a woman whose emotional outbursts justified Richard's affair with Vanessa, a glamorous and ambitious socialite who'd been by his side at every major event for the past year. Vanessa, with her perfectly styled hair and designer dress, sat confidently, her presence a silent challenge to Emily's quiet dignity. The press had already spun the narrative: a scorned wife, a powerful man, and a mistress caught in a love triangle. It was the kind of story that sold papers and kept social media buzzing. But beneath the surface, something far more intricate was at play, a secret that would unravel the entire spectacle. Emily's attorney, a seasoned woman named Clara Henshaw, had been methodical in her approach. She'd presented evidence of Richard's financial manipulations, offshore accounts, hidden assets, and a pattern of funneling money to Vanessa while neglecting his wife and unborn child. Clara's questions were sharp, her arguments airtight, but Richard's team countered with equal force, dismissing Emily's claims as exaggerated and vindictive. The judge, a stern older man named Harold Grayson, listened intently, his expression unreadable behind his wire-rimmed glasses. To the casual observer, he was just another judge presiding over a messy domestic dispute, but there was a glint in his eye, a subtle shift in his posture, that suggested he was more invested than he let on. The turning point came just after the lunch recess. Vanessa, called to the stand to testify about her relationship with Richard, had been prepped to play the sympathetic lover, caught in a passionate affair with a man trapped in a failing marriage. Her testimony was smooth, almost rehearsed, as she described Richard's promises to leave Emily and start a new life with her. She painted herself as a victim of circumstance, a woman in love who believed Richard's marriage was already over. The courtroom hung on her words, some jurors nodding sympathetically, others scribbling notes. Emily, seated at the plaintiff's table, kept her eyes down, her hands folded protectively over her belly. It was a moment of quiet strength, but Vanessa saw it as weakness. Then it happened. As Vanessa stepped down from the stand, she passed by Emily's table, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor. The room was silent, save for the rustle of papers and the soft murmur of spectators. Without warning, Vanessa stopped, turned, and delivered a stinging slap across Emily's face. The sound echoed like a gunshot, and the courtroom erupted in gasps. Emily recoiled, her hand flying to her cheek, shock and pain flashing across her features. Richard froze, his confident facade cracking for the first time. The bailiff rushed forward, but before he could intervene, Vanessa sneered, her voice dripping with contempt. "That's for trying to ruin him," she spat, pointing at Richard, who looked as though he'd been struck himself. The judge's gavel slammed down, the sharp crack silencing the room. "Order!" Judge Grayson barked, his voice like thunder. His eyes, usually calm and detached, burned with an intensity that made everyone pause. "Ms. Langston, you will explain yourself immediately, or you'll be held in contempt." Vanessa, still riding the adrenaline of her outburst, tossed her hair and smirked, as if daring the judge to challenge her. She assumed her connection to Richard, a man with enough money and influence to bend most situations to his will, would shield her. She was wrong. What Vanessa didn't know, what no one in the room except Emily and Clara knew, was that Judge Harold Grayson wasn't just any judge. He was Emily's father. The secret had been carefully guarded, not out of shame but out of necessity. Emily had insisted on keeping her connection to the judge private, wanting her case to stand on its own merits, not on the influence of her father's position. Harold had agreed, though it pained him to watch his daughter endure the public humiliation of her husband's affair and the media's relentless scrutiny. He'd recused himself from cases involving family before, but Emily had begged him to preside over this one, trusting his impartiality despite their bond. He'd agreed, promising to treat her no differently than any other litigant. But Vanessa's slap had just changed everything. Harold's voice was steady, but there was a steel edge to it as he addressed Vanessa. You've just assaulted a pregnant woman in my courtroom. Do you have anything to say for yourself? Vanessa, sensing the shift in the room, faltered. Her bravado wavered as she glanced at Richard, who avoided her gaze, his face pale. The reporters in the back scribbled furiously, sensing a story that was about to explode beyond their wildest expectations. Clara, quick to seize the moment, rose to her feet. Your Honor, this act of violence only underscores the pattern of abuse and disrespect my client has endured. We request immediate sanctions against Ms. Langston and a re-evaluation of the defendant's character in light of this incident. Richard's lead attorney, a man named Gregory Tate, scrambled to mitigate the damage. Your Honor, this was an emotional outburst, not a reflection of my client's actions or intentions. Ms. Langston acted independently, and we ask the court to consider this an isolated incident. But the judge wasn't listening. His eyes were locked on Emily, who was now being comforted by Clara, a faint red mark blooming on her cheek. For the first time, Harold's impartial mask slipped, and the room saw a father's anger, not just a judge's indignation. Ms. Langston, Harold said, his voice low and dangerous, you will be detained pending a hearing on this assault. Bailiff, escort her out. The bailiff moved swiftly, cuffing a stunned Vanessa as she protested, her voice rising in disbelief. You can't do this. Do you know who I am? She shouted, but the judge's expression didn't waver. As she was led away, the courtroom buzzed with whispers, the reporters already typing headlines on their phones. Richard, for his part, sat motionless, his world unraveling in real time. It was Clara who dropped the next bombshell. Rising again, she addressed the court with a calm that belied the weight of her words. Your Honor, there's something the court should know. My client has withheld this information to ensure a fair trial, but in light of today's events, it's relevant. Judge Grayson is Emily's father. The room exploded into chaos. Reporters shouted questions, jurors gasped, and Richard's attorneys exchanged frantic glances. Richard himself looked as though he'd been punched, his mouth open, his eyes darting between Emily and the judge. He hadn't known. No one had. Harold raised his gavel, silencing the room once more. I have presided over this case with impartiality, and I will continue to do so, he said, his voice steady but strained. However, in light of this revelation and Ms. Langston's actions, I'm ordering a recess to review the proceedings and ensure no bias has influenced my rulings. We will reconvene tomorrow. With that, he stood and left the bench, leaving the courtroom in stunned silence. As the spectators filed out, the story was already spreading like wildfire. Social media posts on X captured the moment. Mistress slaps pregnant wife in court, doesn't know judge is her dad. Hashtag courtroom drama, read 1. Another speculated, Millionaire's about to lose everything, did he know the judge was her father? The press swarmed Emily and Clara outside, but Emily said nothing, her hand resting protectively on her belly as she was ushered into a waiting car. Richard, meanwhile, was mobbed by cameras, his attorneys shielding him as he tried to process the revelation that had just upended his carefully constructed defense. The next day would bring more shocks, as Clara prepared to present evidence that Richard had known about Emily's connection to the judge and had tried to use it to manipulate her into dropping the case. But for now, the courtroom was empty, the echoes of Vanessa's slap and Harold's gavel lingering in the air. Emily, despite the pain and humiliation, felt a quiet strength. She'd endured betrayal, violence, and public scrutiny, but she wasn't broken. And with her father on the bench, justice, however complicated, felt within reach. https://www.youtube.com/watch. V equals YWXYP underscore Chi 0 I https://www.youtube.com/watch. V equals QB underscore ISSGIC08. The courtroom buzzed with tension, a low hum of whispers rippling through the spectators like static electricity. The air felt heavy, charged with the anticipation of a scandal unfolding in real time. At the center of it all stood the pregnant wife, her hand pressed protectively against her swollen belly, her face a mask of composure despite the sting of the slap that had just echoed through the room. The mistress, a woman draped in confidence as sharp as her crimson heels, stood defiant, her eyes glinting with a mix of triumph and disdain. She had struck the wife in a moment of raw audacity, believing her position as the millionaire's paramour gave her untouchable status. The millionaire himself, a man whose wealth was matched only by his arrogance, sat stiffly in his tailored suit, his jaw tight as he tried to process the chaos erupting before him. But the real shock, the one that would unravel everything, was still to come. No one in the room, least of all the millionaire, knew that the judge presiding over this case was the pregnant wife's father. The judge, a man in his late 60s with silver hair and a face carved from years of upholding justice, sat elevated behind the bench. His expression was unreadable, a granite wall of impartiality, but beneath the surface, a storm brewed. He had recognized his daughter the moment she entered the courtroom, her familiar gait and the way she held her shoulders betraying her identity even before he saw her face. He hadn't known she was pregnant. His daughter had kept her distance in recent months, likely to shield him from the mess her marriage had become. Now, seeing her standing there, humiliated by a slap from a woman who reeked of entitlement, his blood simmered. But he was a judge first, a father second, and he would not let his emotions betray him, not yet. The mistress's slap had been no accident. It was a calculated act, a power play meant to assert dominance in front of the courtroom's watchful eyes. She had sauntered up to the wife during a recess, her lips curled into a sneer, and delivered the blow with a flourish, as if daring anyone to challenge her. Gasps filled the room, followed by a stunned silence. The wife staggered back, her hand flying to her cheek, but she didn't cry out. Instead, her eyes locked onto the mistress's, a quiet fire burning in them. The millionaire, seated at the defense table, shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting between the two women. He hadn't expected this, not the slap, not the public spectacle. His carefully curated image as a man in control was crumbling, and he could feel the weight of every stare in the room. The bailiff moved to intervene, but the judge raised a hand, halting him. "Order," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The room fell silent, every pair of eyes now on him. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze sweeping over the scene. The mistress, still standing with her chin raised. The wife, her hand now back on her belly, her posture defiant, and the millionaire, whose usual swagger had been replaced by a flicker of unease. The judge's voice was calm but carried an edge that made the hairs on the back of the millionaire's neck stand up. "We will proceed with the case. Counsel, approach the bench." The attorneys, one for the wife and one for the millionaire, hurried forward, their faces a mix of confusion and apprehension. The wife's attorney, a sharp-eyed woman with a reputation for tearing through weak defenses, whispered something to her client before stepping toward the judge. The millionaire's attorney, a slick man who thrived on high-profile cases, adjusted his tie and followed. The judge's instructions were brief, his tone clipped. He wanted the case to move forward without further theatrics, but his eyes lingered on his daughter for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. She didn't meet his gaze. She couldn't, not yet. The case itself was a messy divorce proceeding, one that had already made headlines due to the millionaire's infidelity and the wife's pregnancy. The mistress, emboldened by her role in the millionaire's life, had insisted on being present, claiming she had a stake in the outcome. The wife, meanwhile, was fighting for more than just alimony. She wanted justice, not just for herself but for the child she carried. The slap had been the mistress's attempt to undermine her, to paint her as weak and unworthy in the eyes of the court. But the wife was no shrinking violet. She had grown up under the shadow of her father's gavel, learning the art of resilience from a man who had faced down corruption and scandal in his decades on the bench. She would not break, not here, not now. As the proceedings resumed, the wife's attorney called her to the stand. The room seemed to hold its breath as she walked forward, her steps deliberate, her chin high. The slap had left a faint red mark on her cheek, but she wore it like a badge, a reminder of the indignity she had endured. Her attorney began with soft questions, establishing her character, her commitment to her marriage, and her devastation upon learning of her husband's affair. The wife's voice was steady, though it trembled slightly when she spoke of the moment she discovered the mistress's existence. She described finding text messages, late-night calls, and receipts for lavish gifts, evidence of a life her husband had built without her. The courtroom listened, rapt, as she painted a picture of betrayal that was both intimate and universal. The millionaire's attorney tried to poke holes in her story, suggesting she had known about the affair and had chosen to stay for the money. But the wife was prepared. She produced documents, bank statements, emails, even a handwritten note from the mistress taunting her about the affair. The attorney faltered, his questions losing their bite as the wife's composure held firm. The mistress, seated in the gallery, shifted in her seat, her earlier confidence waning. She hadn't expected the wife to fight back so fiercely, nor had she anticipated the weight of the evidence piling up against her lover. The judge, meanwhile, watched it all unfold with a growing sense of purpose. He had spent his career upholding the law, but this case was personal. He knew he should recuse himself. His connection to the plaintiff was a conflict of interest, but he also knew that no one else in this courthouse would handle the case with the same care. His daughter deserved justice, and he would ensure she got it, even if it meant bending the rules just a little. He kept his questions neutral, his rulings fair, but he was cataloging every detail, every misstep by the millionaire and his mistress. Then came the moment that changed everything. The wife's attorney called a surprise witness, a private investigator who had been tailing the millionaire for months. The investigator, a wiry man with a no-nonsense demeanor, presented photos, recordings, and a detailed timeline of the millionaire's affair. The evidence was damning. Secret meetings in hotel rooms, extravagant trips paid for with company funds, and, most shockingly, a recorded conversation in which the millionaire promised the mistress he would leave his wife after the baby was born. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and the millionaire's face turned ashen. The mistress, for the first time, looked genuinely afraid. The judge banged his gavel, silencing the room. He turned to the millionaire's attorney, his voice low but laced with steel. "Does your client have anything to say in response to this evidence?" The attorney stammered, clearly unprepared for the depth of the investigator's findings. The millionaire, realizing the tide was turning against him, leaned over and whispered frantically to his counsel. But it was too late. The truth was out, and it was undeniable. The wife, still on the stand, allowed herself a small, victorious smile. She glanced at her father, their eyes meeting for the first time since the trial began. In that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. He was proud of her strength, her refusal to be broken by betrayal or violence. She, in turn, drew strength from his presence, knowing that the man who had taught her to stand tall was watching over her now. The mistress, sensing her world collapsing, stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This is a sham," She shouted, her voice shrill. She's lying, they're all lying. The bailiff moved toward her, but the judge raised his hand again, his eyes locking onto hers. You will sit down, or you will be removed, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The mistress hesitated, then sank back into her seat, her bravado shattered. As the trial continued, the judge's rulings grew sharper, his questions more pointed. He didn't need to reveal his connection to the wife. The truth was doing its own work, dismantling the millionaire's carefully constructed facade. The evidence mounted, the whispers grew louder, and the millionaire's empire began to crumble under the weight of his own deceit. The wife, once seen as the vulnerable party, emerged as the victor, her dignity intact, her future secured. And the judge, her father, sat back in his chair, knowing that justice, in its own quiet way, had prevailed.